Look, thanks for your generous introduction. It's nice to be here. And as Barbara Bush once memorably said, at 85, it's nice to be anywhere. Uh, I'm I'm reminded of a comment that Geoffrey Blaney once made, that one of the pleasures of being a retired academic is that you no longer need new information, just a new audience. And I'm hoping that he's right. Uh, as during my career, I've been lucky enough to be involved with several important activities. It's led me to ponder on the nature of luck in science. Pardon me. And to my mind, there are two sorts of luck. The first is the luck that you've got no control over. And those of us who are lucky enough to have been born in or migrated to Australia in the 1940s and 50s are probably the luckiest generation to have ever lived. We grew up in a prosperous, underpopulated continent, enjoyed an excellent and largely free education, and were beneficiaries of the Whitlam government's investment in tertiary education, which enabled many young people to assume positions of influence much earlier than was previously possible. We truly won the cosmic lottery. But then there's another form of luck. A commentator once remarked to Gary Player that he seemed to be extremely lucky, to which Player responded, "The harder I practice, the luckier I get." And if practice is the golfer's secret sauce, is there an equivalent for the aspiring scientist? In thinking about my career, the answer is definitely yes, although modern communication technology may have made some of the things that helped me much less important today. And for those of you who are about to doze off, the answers are connecting with people who matter, developing a useful skill set, identifying where the action is or is likely to be, seizing opportunities when they arise, and keeping an eye on the big picture. Let me begin with how I became a medical virologist and then provide a few examples of those factors at work in my involvement with hepatitis and AIDS, the birth of the Burnett Institute, and finally, my time at CSL. As a schoolboy, inspired by a book on the lives of Louis Pasteur and Marie Curie, I decided on a career of medical research, but I had absolutely no idea how to go about it. Among my parents' wide circle of friends, only one, Jack Legg, who worked in the biochemistry department at the University of Melbourne, was a scientist. They arranged for me to meet him in his laboratory. It was an exciting time in the field, and Jack's enthusiasm for its possibilities was infectious. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratories were offering paid cadetships for biochemistry students, so I applied for science and a cadetship and was offered both. Then a chance encounter with my school friend David Mushin's older brother, then a fourth-year medical student, transformed my life. He said, "If you want to do medical research, do medicine. It opens up so many more possibilities." I did, and it did. It remains the best piece of advice I've ever had. I found the first 3 years of the course, with its large dose of anatomy, uninspiring, and spent more time in the billiard room than in the dissecting hall. And then I had another stroke of luck. As Davo has just mentioned, Pansy Wright, the eccentric but gifted head of the Department of Physiology, had persuaded the Commonwealth to allow students to undertake a research year without losing their scholarships. And in 1961, three students, Barney Carroll, John Matthews and I, took the opportunity. It was money well spent, as not only did all of us subsequently enter the field, but each of us later established a new institute. On returning to the medical course, we were exiled to the back row of the lecture theatre, where we were frequently joined by Dai Long, an attractive English migrant with a long pigtail who spent the time knitting, jotting down a few notes at the end. I found that combination fascinating, and 64 years, 5 children and 11 grandchildren later, still do. Talk about luck. After becoming a resident medical officer at the Alfred, I was faced with the choice of what career to pursue. So I asked myself which of the subjects that I'd studied had I enjoyed the most and seemed to have some aptitude for. And the answer was microbiology, but I had no idea what a working microbiologist actually did. So then I had another stroke of luck. I went to see the hospital microbiologist, the shy, chain-smoking Glenn Buckle, famous for first isolating the flesh-eating Bairnsdale bacillus. And I explained my dilemma. And Glenn arranged a series of visits with human and veterinary microbiologists. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, I visited them all, as I quickly decided that the life of a hospital microbiologist was boring and the newly emerging field of virology much more interesting. I decided to consult Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who was not only a Nobel laureate in immunology, but also a distinguished virologist. Burnet's strong view was that the development of antibiotics and vaccines had ended the golden era of microbiology. He urged me to become an immunologist. Whether it was because I'm a bit of a contrarian or that I was scared of the competition of the super smart students being attracted to immunology, I rejected his advice. While clinical virology was still a cottage industry and the techniques available too slow to produce results that could influence clinical management, it seemed likely to me that that could change. Furthermore, as viruses were responsible for so much disease, the discipline provided an opportunity to have impact on human health at a global level. So having decided on a career in virology, the question was how? Mac Burnett had changed the focus of the Hall Institute from virology to immunology, and Frank Fenner, who'd previously led a major team at the John Curtin School in Canberra, had moved into environmental studies. What to do? I sought out Sid Rubo, the charismatic head of the Department of Microbiology, and the only virologist in his department, David White. And Sid's advice was get a broad experience before specialising. He suggested I entered into the College of Pathologists training program, but train it specifically for my needs. The college, which had never had a request like that before, was very accommodating, agreeing to me spending a couple of years as a pathology registrar and then the next 3 in an appropriate centre in the United States. So in 1966, I was accepted as a pathology registrar at Fairfield Hospital for Infectious Diseases. It was the last job I ever applied for. Fairfield was a wonderful place to work with its interesting mix of patients and its bucolic setting adjacent to the Yarra Bend National Park. It was led by John Forbes, who believed that good medical practice was informed by research, encouraged his staff to develop their own interests, and tried to provide them with some protected time to pursue them. The laboratory was headed by Alan Ferris, who'd worked with Fenner in the Army Medical Corps during the World War II. And while at Fairfield, I developed a special interest in viral hepatitis, which was a major public health problem. At that time, 2 etiologically and clinically distinct forms, A and B, were recognised, but neither causative agent had been identified. Hepatitis A was enterically transmitted and very common, leading to the admission of 700 or 800 patients at Fairfield every year. Hepatitis B, which was transmitted by contact with infected blood, was thought to be extremely rare, and it was widely believed that whoever discovered the cause would probably win a Nobel Prize, a prediction that proved correct. While my first 2 years of training was set, my US component was not. David White suggested that I contact Carl Johnson, the Indiana Jones-like figure in charge of the Middle Americas Research Unit, which was based in the Panama Canal Zone and undertaking pioneering studies of insect-borne viral infections in Central and Southern America. The combination of science and adventure was appealing, so I contacted Carl and was offered a fellowship. I'd started learning Spanish when a wave of anti-American sentiment forced closure of the unit and repatriation of the staff, and I was left stranded. Then I had another piece of luck. As the news broke, the hospital was being visited by Charles Coburn, then head of WHO's Division of Communicable Diseases. Coburn, a Scottish epidemiologist, had been responsible for establishing WHO's network of collaborating centres, which provided the organisation with valuable information on the prevalence of virus diseases throughout the world, pardon me, and the capacity to investigate outbreaks. Coburn was impressed by the potential of the Fairfield lab to play a major role in the Western Pacific and had designated it as a collaborating centre, but was concerned that Alan had no obvious successor. He persuaded John that I was a suitable candidate and suggested that I enrol for the Diploma of Bacteriology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then follow it with a year in Norman Gust's laboratory in Glasgow, then one of the two best diagnostic laboratories in the world. They agreed, and such was Coburn's influence that although all 12 places in the next intake had been allocated, the school agreed to make it a baker's dozen. In those days, air travel was prohibitively expensive, so those of us travelling to the UK for postgraduate studies usually went free as ship's doctors. So in mid-1967, I found myself aboard the MV English Star, a 10,000-tonne refrigerated freighter bound for Europe and the UK. We were delayed in Fremantle, where we spent time with the crew of our sister ship, the Scottish Star, which departed a few days ahead of us. It was June 1967. And approaching the Red Sea, the captain was advised that war between Israel and Egypt was imminent and ordered to divert via the Cape of Good Hope. The Scottish Star was not so lucky and was trapped in the Bitter Lakes, and the crew was not relieved for 6 months. The ship was later sold for scrap, but for the delay in Fremantle, that would have been me. The dip back was designed to develop future leaders of the British Public Health Laboratory Service and their counterparts from the colonies. One of our teachers, Ari Zuckerman, led a group searching for the hepatitis virus and took a particular interest in me. And it was to his lab that I rushed when, browsing in the laboratory one day, I came across Fred Prince's seminal paper in Vox Sanguinis, demonstrating that an antigen previously described by Barry Bloomberg in serum obtained from an Australian Aboriginal and named the Australia antigen, was a specific marker of the presence of the hepatitis B virus. We both realised that that was a game changer and it would put the study of both forms of hepatitis on a firm scientific footing. Not long after that, David Dane examined serum containing the Australia antigen under the electron microscope and detected the double-shelled hepatitis B virions, which now bear his name, along with a vast excess of spherical and tubular material. These other particles represent excess coat material, which is never assembled into mature infectious virus. Almost a decade later, the ability to separate and purify the spheres and tubules was to form the basis of the first licensed hepatitis B vaccine. With the dip back completed, now joined by Di, I travelled to Glasgow to join Norman Grist's group at Ruckhill Hospital. While still a high-class diagnostic laboratory, it was pretty soon clear that its best days had passed. I settled in, learned as much as I could, enjoyed the Scottish countryside, the golf and the whisky, but was bored. And then I had another piece of luck. In 1969, the annual two-day meeting of Scottish and Scandinavian scientists with an interest in infectious diseases was held in Glasgow, and I was invited to attend. The meeting was a revelation. The Scandinavian participants were generally young and energetic. Most had studied in the United States, and all were research orientated. One, Pekka Hallinen, had just developed a hemagglutinin inhibition assay for detection of rubella antibodies, which was revolutionising the field. I felt that I'd found my tribe and wanted more. With introductions from Norman Grist and the blessing of Charles Coburn, during our 8-week summer break, Di and I drove our Morris minivan through Western Europe, Scandinavia, Soviet Union, Poland and Czechoslovakia, camping and visiting the laboratories of most of the major figures in the field. At that time, virology was a relatively new discipline, and the practitioners formed a kind of extended family. Many of the senior figures had held important medical or scientific roles during World War II, and almost all had been involved in the successful introduction of polio vaccine in their own countries, becoming national heroes. We were greeted wonderfully everywhere except the Soviet Union, where it was assumed that we were spies and we were followed everywhere by the secret police. Our time in Glasgow was coming to an end, and I wrote to both Prince and Bloomberg asking if I could visit, and when both agreed, persuaded Charles Coburn to allow me to detour via the US while Di returned with our belongings and our cat Chairman Meow by ship. So, armed with letters of introduction and saying in YMCAs, I made my way down the east coast before crossing the country, heading in Ed Lanette's laboratory in California. And in so doing, I met most of the giants of the field: Fred Prince, Barry Bloomberg, Bob McCollum, Bob Chanak, Harvey Alter, Stan Plotkin, John Enders, Tom Weller, Joe Melnick, Natalie Schmidt, 2 Nobel laureates and 2 future ones. As young Australian virologists arriving on Greyhound buses were not all that common at the time, they treated me kindly. Fred Prince was especially helpful, providing me with several ampoules of his precious diagnostic reagents, which I wrapped in cotton wool, placed inside a cigarette tin and smuggled home. I arrived back early in 1970 with more than a year of training to go, a wonderful set of contacts, and an assay which would not only transform how patients with hepatitis were managed, but was urgently needed by both the Red Cross Blood Transfusion Service and by CSL. Assisting those organisations establish their own capabilities created linkages and trust that was to prove invaluable years later when we were confronted by AIDS. As we and others began testing, it soon became obvious that hepatitis B was vastly more common than previously realised, that infection was sometimes associated with a chronic carrier state, that the earlier in life that an individual was infected, the more likely it was that they'd become a chronic carrier, and that chronic carriage was not a benign condition, but it resulted in an increased risk that the subject would develop chronic liver disease or primary hepatocellular carcinoma. All was going well when out of the blue Alan Ferris and John Forbes had a falling out and Alan moved to Monash University. With no other medically trained option, although I was not yet a qualified pathologist and had 0 administrative experience, I was appointed head of a laboratory which contained several highly experienced scientists, some of whom were old enough to be my parents. I was lucky that they were tolerant as I learnt on the job, and they were pleased that in the hepatitis assay I was creating interest in and bringing some additional resources to the laboratory. Now that the hepatitis B virus had been identified, in collaboration with colleagues at Monash, we began searching for the hepatitis A virus in the faeces of patients who'd been naturally infected, but were pipped at the post by Steve Feinstein in Bob Purcell's lab at NIH, who identified the characteristic 27 nanometer particles in the faeces of volunteers who'd been experimentally infected. The development of specific assays for the detection of hepatitis A virus and antibodies directed against it not only enabled us to study the epidemiology and the natural history of the disease, but led to the recognition that some episodes of hepatitis were due to viruses other than A and B, and we now recognise at least three other forms, C, D and E. As the hepatitis field was moving rapidly, WHO established an expert committee which met regularly to summarise progress, make recommendations to national authorities, and identify priority areas for research. Jim Maynard from CDC, Bob Purcell, Ari Zuckerman, Fritz Deinhardt from the Pettenkoffer Institute in Munich, and Marie Silliman from Merck were core members. And since all of those groups were located in universities and research institutes in the Northern Hemisphere, the fact that our lab was located in a hospital and was located in the Southern Hemisphere led to me being invited to join the group. It soon became apparent that the global burden of hepatitis B was enormous and that the disease was potentially vaccine preventable. After John Geron and Bob Purcell demonstrated that formalin-treated 22 nanometer particles purified from the plasma of chronic carriers would protect chimpanzees against challenge with the virus, Marie Silliman at Merck established the process at a commercial scale. And once the vaccine's safety and efficacy had been demonstrated in clinical trial, the vaccine was licensed in 1981. But to cover the enormous development cost, which included building and validating a new production facility, Merck initially priced the vaccine at more than US $200 for the three-dose schedule, thereby restricting its use to those with the capacity to pay. Before elaborating on the next stage of the hepatitis B vaccine story, I'd like to go back a little in time and recount how the first hepatitis A vaccine was developed, which was partly a combination of good luck and partly good planning. In 1978, Bob Purcell invited me to spend a sabbatical at the National Institutes of Health. So with Di and four small children in tow, off we went. The original plan was to look for any differences in Australian and American strains of the virus by studying their behaviour in marmosets and chimpanzees using fecal samples that we'd collected during a family outbreak in Melbourne. But unfortunately, the flight carrying the samples was delayed, and when the parcel arrived at NIH, all the dry ice in which it was packed had evaporated. So we assumed that any virus present would have perished and put the samples in a freezer while I started work on another project. But some months later, Steve Feinstein and I heard that the lab had three aging marmosets that were about to be euthanized but were suitable for a simple yes-no experiment. And we decided to test whether any of the Fairfield samples contained viable virus, choosing the one provided by the father and coded HM175. We prepared sterile fecal extracts, injected them intravenously into each animal, and then collected blood, feces, and liver biopsy samples at regular intervals. Now, in experimentally infected marmosets, the clinical pattern is very similar to man, with the first signs of liver damage appearing about 4 weeks after infection. But to our surprise, each of the marmosets showed elevated liver enzymes about 10 days after inoculation. We were puzzled by that and sacrificed one animal and left the other two, both of which developed a second spike of elevated enzymes at the usual time. And so we wondered if the first peak was caused by the virus replicating in the liver and the second by an immune reaction to its presence, and speculated that the reason that nobody to date had been able to grow the virus in cell culture was because they were using specimens collected at this second time, by which time any virus that was present might be bound by antibodies. So when we inoculated material collected during that first spike into cell culture, the virus grew and it could be detected by immunofluorescence. So in my long career It's my single eureka moment. Our hypothesis, however, was wrong, as we were able to isolate the virus equally readily from samples collected during the second peak. By sheer luck, we'd stumbled on a sample with an extraordinarily high titer of virus. Bob Purcell had been prepared for the eventuality and ensured that the cell line that we were working in was certified for vaccine production. So over the next few years, HM175 was attenuated by repeated passage in cell culture. The mutations responsible for their attenuation were identified, and a candidate vaccine developed using a process very similar to that used by Jonas Salk to develop the first inactivated polio vaccine. Once the candidate vaccine had been shown to protect marmosets and chimpanzees against infection, NIH licensed the process and the associated intellectual property to GSK, who established a large-scale production facility in Belgium. The vaccine was licensed in 1991 and is known as Havrix, and since then, either alone or in combination with GSK's hepatitis B vaccine, has been administered to more than 500 million people, and the disease is now almost unknown in the developed world. This work led to a certain amount of recognition, including a black tie event in the Great Hall of the Art Gallery, and in the aftermath, somebody asked me what was I planning next. Pansy Wright, who by that time was Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, was standing nearby and overheard the question and answered it for me in his gruff voice, "More of the same, only better." It was a comment that would have a big impact more than a decade later. To return to hepatitis B, in the mid-1970s, my friend Paul Zimmet had begun his pioneering studies on diabetes in Pacific Islanders. He asked me whether I'd be interested in testing sera he'd collected in Nauru. We did, and found an extremely high incidence of hepatitis B infection and very high carrier rates. And that led to an invitation from the South Pacific Commission to study the prevalence of infection in other island populations and advise the Pacific health ministers on an appropriate course of action. While the Commission had a wide remit, it had no laboratory facilities and was totally reliant on external collaboration. So Paul and I saw an amazing opportunity and began to fill that gap. It was interesting and exciting work in amazing locations, then completely untouched by tourism. Travelling to remote Pacific islands in tiny aeroplanes, being greeted by the village chief, drinking kava with the elders, and being presented with a freshly roasted pig was as good as it gets and satisfied my desire for adventure. In the course of this work, we convinced the Nauruan government that hepatitis B could be controlled by immunising every newborn baby. And even though the vaccine was expensive, the number of babies born to a population of 5,500 was sufficiently small that it could be afforded. And Nauru thus became the first country in the world with a national hepatitis B control program. Our work in the Pacific came to the attention of the WHO Office for the Western Pacific, and Jim Maynard from CDC and I were invited to lead a task force to advise them on a course of action. The Western Pacific is the largest and most populous of WHO's regions. Hepatitis B is endemic. The carrier rate in most countries is more than 4%, leading to an enormous burden of chronic liver disease and hepatocellular carcinoma. Although it would take a long time to see the benefit, clearly the best strategy would be universal childhood immunisation, with the first dose administered soon after birth to minimise the risk of transmission from carrier mothers to their babies. The problem was that the high cost of the vaccine made mass immunisation impractical. At that time, Hiroshi Nakajima, the director of the Western Pacific Regional Office, was looking for a major project in China which would bolster his chances of becoming the next Director General of WHO. It was not difficult to convince him that transferring an alternative production process developed at the Kitasato Institute in Tokyo to 4 selected Chinese manufacturers fitted the bill. Nakajima secured funding for the project from Japan, and Jim and I made several trips to China to oversee the process. China in the 1980s was not the powerhouse it is now, and even institute directors travelled to work by bicycle. So the work was slow, and the amount of vaccine produced measured in millions of doses, not the tens or hundreds of millions of doses that were required. And it was not until Merck later established a plant in China that was possible to satisfy the entire national demand. As hepatitis B vaccine was still largely a boutique product, in 1986, a group of people, some of whom had been part of WHO's expert committees and task forces, met for a boozy dinner in New York and decided to try and find a way to immunise every child in the world. And the group included 3 legends of the field, Fred Prince, Palmer Beasley and Jim Maynard, and we agreed to form a group called the International Task Force for Hepatitis B Immunisation. With support from the McDonald Foundation and later the Australian International Development Aid Bureau, the task force conducted pilot immunisation projects on the feasibility of providing hepatitis B vaccine to newborn babies in several developing countries, encouraging new manufacturers to join existing producers in open tenders with the assurance from the countries involved that if the pilot program was a success, the vaccine could be acquired for about US $1 a dose, the program would be rolled out nationwide. The initiative was assisted by the arrival of 2 new Korean manufacturers who, in order to gain market share, were prepared to offer their vaccine in multi-dose vials at less than its production cost. The first pilot project using vaccine produced by the Korean Green Cross was conducted on the island of Lombok and led by Tilman Ruff from our laboratory, and its success persuaded the Indonesian government to expand the program nationwide. In 1993, after pilot projects conducted by the task force elsewhere in Asia and in Africa had generated similar results, the World Health Organization was persuaded to add hepatitis B vaccine to the routine childhood immunisation schedule under its expanded program for immunisation, the EPI. And today, as a result of the entry of large-scale generic manufacturers, mainly based in India, the vaccine is available to the EPI at less than 25 cents a dose. The battle to add hepatitis B vaccine to the EPI, however, highlighted the broader problem of making any new vaccine available in the developing world. And it was recognised that significant additional funding and better coordination between producers and end users was required. So in 2000, a new body, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation, or Gavi, was created to do so, and with major donations from many developed countries, and particularly from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi's been a huge success. As a result of its efforts, nearly 85% of all children worldwide are now fully immunised, receiving 3 doses of the hepatitis B vaccine. Now, a couple of stories combining luck, contacts, a useful skill set, good timing, an eye for the big picture, and a bit of chutzpah. In the early 1980s, a mischievous colleague of mine at the John Curtin for Medical Research, Graham Laver, learnt that Telstra was evaluating a new international direct dialing system and charmed them into giving him free access to a phone to evaluate the system. As we were working with NIH on the development of the hepatitis A vaccine at the time, I approached the organisation and was provided with similar access, which meant that in those pre-internet days, I was able to speak daily with colleagues in the US and Europe as required. It provided an enormous advantage when the first cases of what we now recognise as AIDS began to appear in New York and San Francisco. Initially considered to be a medical curiosity, it soon became apparent that AIDS had many of the characteristics of a blood-borne infectious diseases. And while Haftan Mala, the Director General of WHO, initially regarded AIDS as a first world problem not worthy of the organisation's attention, Thackeray Assad, the then head of Communicable Diseases Division, thought otherwise, and in November 1982 assembled a group of people to advise him. The group contained many with experience with hepatitis B infection and two not well known at the time, Jonathan Mann, a young CDC-trained epidemiologist who was working in Zaire, and Luc Montagnier, a virologist from the Pasteur Institute. Jonathan described the devastating effect of the disease in rural Africa, while Luc, in halting English, spoke of his confidence that he and his colleagues had identified the causative agent. Montaigne's presentation was subject to very harsh criticism, and he was trying to respond when the session was interrupted by a fire alarm. And while we were waiting outside in the courtyard, I approached Montaigne and asked whether he could send us some of his infected cells so that we could try and verify his findings, which he agreed to do. Over the summer of 82-83, he forwarded material to us on two occasions, but on both times the cells failed to grow. Shortly after the Geneva meeting, Bob Gallo at the National Institutes of Health claimed to have independently identified the virus, and an unseemly disagreement about precedence took place. While the dispute resulted in agreement to share the royalties generated by subsequent diagnostic tests, the Nobel Committee was in no doubt who should take credit for the discovery of the virus and awarded the prize to Montagnier and his colleague Francis Barré-Sinousset. After the failure to transfer Montagnier's technology, I arranged for my colleague Robbie Pringle to travel to the US to bring back reagents, which enabled us to establish the assays in-house. At that time in Australia, AIDS was regarded as an exotic disease, the consensus being that apart from the occasional case imported from and acquired overseas, we'd probably be largely spared. During the period that we were trying to establish the assays in Australia, AIDS had been detected in some American patients with haemophilia, raising concern that the US blood collection system had been compromised. In developed countries, patients with haemophilia led reasonably normal lives because they had access to regular infusions of clotting factors extracted from pools of plasma collected from healthy blood donors. Once the problem was recognised, CDC began studies to determine whether heat treatment of clotting factors would inactivate the virus, information that my colleague Ron Lucas, who was on sabbatical in the age group at CDC, relayed to me in our regular phone calls, and which I passed on to CSL. The need for a sensitive screening test for blood donors, however, was obvious and was urgent. In June 1984, the US government issued samples of the virus, which had been isolated in Gallo's lab, to 6 manufacturers, challenging them to devise commercial assays which could be used to screen large numbers of blood donors. Once we had established assays for HIV antibody in-house, I contacted the clinicians who cared for most Victorians with haemophilia, and through them was able to access fresh and stored samples of serum. And to our surprise and their dismay, we found that not only were nearly a third of Victorian patients with haemophilia already infected with HIV, but there was evidence that the virus had been circulating silently since 1981. Clearly, our early assumptions that Australia would largely be spared were wrong. In November 1984, as the country was preparing for a federal election, a catalytic event knocked politics off the front page. John Duffy, a paediatrician at the Mater Hospital in Brisbane, was asked to see a baby that was failing to thrive, had developed an opportunistic infection, and had an abnormally low T-cell count. By luck, he mentioned that case to a pathologist friend when they were out sailing the following weekend, and the pathologist remarked that it reminded him very much of a child on whom he'd recently conducted an autopsy. So on Monday morning, when they went back to work, they checked the children's records and found that both had been premature and both had received top-up transfusions from the same donor, a middle-aged, unmarried man. Aliquots of this donor's blood had also been transfused to two other babies, one of whom had died shortly afterwards, the other of whom had developed similar symptoms. O'Duffy wondered if the children could possibly be suffering from paediatric AIDS. He rang me and arranged for samples from the index case and one of the other babies to be flown down to Melbourne. We tested them overnight and they were both positive. The donor was recalled and rebled, and he too was positive. To say that that caused concern was an understatement. With the election looming, Neil Blewett called a crisis meeting of health ministers in the old Treasury building in Melbourne for the following Sunday, November the 18th. But by chance, I was in Canberra on the Friday prior to the meeting when David Pennington, who was at that time head of the AIDS Task Force, and Spike Langsford, then head of the Public Health Division, the Commonwealth Department of Health, asked me what I thought we should do to accelerate the introduction of screening tests into blood bank. It's rare to have the opportunity to design an entire diagnostic system from scratch, let alone the political will and the financial resources to implement it. My advice was, firstly, to engage with the US-based manufacturers and if they were agreeable, to conduct an independent evaluation of the quality of their assays, and assuming that some or all were satisfactory, the government should control the importation of the assays, then introduce the test simultaneously in blood banks, plasma fractionation centres, and selected public health laboratories in each state and territory, and collect and analyse the data that was generated. I sketched out a three-tier testing scheme on the back of an envelope, with screening tests conducted in blood banks and public health laboratories as the first tier, backed up by state reference laboratories offering confirmatory tests as the second tier, and at the apex of the pyramid, a national reference laboratory whose responsibility would be to evaluate current and future assays, train staff, establish quality assurance programs, develop consensus on the interpretation of results, and provide the final court of appeal for contentious results. Given that the NRL would need to act swiftly, I thought it would be better if it was independent of the Department of Health and the TGA, which created a major battle, which fortunately David and I won. I prepared an indicative budget and David presented the proposal to the meeting on Sunday, which endorsed it. Tom Roper, the then Victorian Health Minister, turned to me and asked me how much additional support was required. I thought of a number and doubled it. And then thus the National AIDS Reference Laboratory was established at Fairfield and I became its first director. Over Christmas, while the hospital's maintenance staff converted an old animal house into a basic lab, I worked the phones to liaise with the manufacturers and assemble a panel of 1,000 sera on which the assays would be evaluated. and to create a network of competent centres in which the panels could be tested. The panel comprised a mix of healthy blood donors, patients with AIDS, and serial twofold dilutions of known HIV-positive sera. Several lab staff returned from holidays to assemble the panels, divide them into duplicate aliquots, so that each participating laboratory received 2,000 samples under code. 5 laboratories in South and East Australia participated in the evaluation. The relationships and trust that had been built up during the introduction of screening tests for hepatitis B were critical in gaining the support of blood bank directors involved, and in particular in mollifying the feelings of those who were excluded. All of the manufacturers were keen to participate, as a successful outcome would be of great commercial significance. When the data was analysed, 2 of the 5 assays were found to have high sensitivity, specificity, and reproducibility. And after sharing that information with the study participants and the blood bank directors on the 12th of March, the government opened tenders for supply of the kits to the 2 selected manufacturers the following Monday and closed tenders at the end of that week. When the tests were rolled out nationwide, a month later, Australia became the first country in the world to introduce routine screening to blood banks and public health institutions. And that work is almost certainly the reason why, in June 1984, along with the Pasteur Institute and CDC, the lab at Fairfield was designated as one of the 3 inaugural WHO collaborating centres for HIV and associated viruses. The rapid introduction of screening tests was the result of amazing good luck and having all of our ducks in a row. No other country had the combination of a health minister with a special interest in the field and cabinet clout, an advisory body led by David Pennington, who was politically influential, the catalytic effect of the Queensland babies, and the urgency created by an imminent election. Whereas others moved slowly and cautiously, we were able to crash through. I had always envisaged the NRL would be a sunset organisation ending when its mission was completed, but largely through the vision of my successor, Liz Dax, it's developed a broader role and is still going strong 40 years later. Now a few words on the Burnet Institute. In the 1970s, as our work on hepatitis A and B began to attract external support, basic research began to comprise a significant proportion of the laboratory's work. While John Forbes was very supportive, I was conscious that the hospital board saw patient care as its primary responsibility, and in a straitened environment, bedpans would always trump test tubes. The model I favoured was a separately funded and governed entity working closely with the hospital, which seemed to work well elsewhere. The need to progress this became more urgent when I returned from my sabbatical at NIH and found that John had retired and been replaced by his deputy, who had decided that research was a burden on the hospital and needed to be curtailed, persuading the board to ask me and my clinical counterpart, Ron Lucas, to leave and threatening repercussions if we didn't. This appalled our colleagues, and when it became clear the administration's position was fixed, almost all of the medical staff and the entire laboratory staff passed a vote of no confidence in the CEO and the board and submitted their resignations. It was a courageous and unprecedented act, as none of us had other jobs to go to. The situation became something of a cause célèbre, with the press, the public and the profession firmly on our side and the board locked in behind its CEO. The impasse continued for many months, and when the 2 university-appointed nominees to the board resigned, and the university refused to replace them, the government asked the Ombudsman to review the situation. His report was highly critical of the CEO and he recommended a number of changes, but when those recommendations were ignored, the minister intervened, sacking the CEO and disbanding the board. It had been a grueling 12 months, but it was a pivotal event. Once a new board was appointed, it readily agreed to establishing the Fairfield Hospital Institute for Medical Research, which was aligned to the hospital but had a separate government structure and myself as the director. Then we had some real luck. In August 1985, following Sir Macfarlane Burnet's death, as the Institute's rather long name lacked a certain cachet, I wrote to his widow asking whether she would agree for it to be named after him. She was quite unwell, but seeing the Fairfield letterhead, thought the message might be important and had a friend read it to her. Fortunately, she gave the request her blessing. So in late 1985, the Fairfield Hospital Institute for Medical Research became the Macfarlane Burnet Centre for Medical Research, subsequently the Burnet Institute. The next challenge was to raise a corpus of money that could be used to provide seed funding for talented young researchers at the start of their career. I had in mind a figure of about $3 million, but had no experience in raising money, and the only really rich person I'd ever met was Dick Pratt, and that encounter had been extremely fleeting. In his youth, Dick had been a talented footballer, playing in Carlton's under-19s and winning the Morrish Medal for the best and fairest in the competition. And then at the twilight of his career, he was playing for Ajax in the B-grade amateurs while acting in Summer of the 17th Doll at the Union Theatre. On a gloomy Saturday afternoon at the Peanut Farm Oval behind Luna Park, just before three-quarter time, Dick went up in the ruck, palmed the ball down to his 19th man, me, and strolled off the ground in order to get to the theatre for the evening performance. Aware that Malcolm Fraser insisted on cabinet submissions being no more than a page in length, and his contention that people usually ignore the substance of a letter but always read the PS, I wrote a one-page letter to Dick and included how we met in the PS. The letter caught his attention. In another stroke of luck, Dick had recently appointed a childhood friend, Gad Travax, to assist him in searching for biotech investment, and he sought Gad's opinion. As the former head of the Health Commission, Gad had not only been the person who advised the minister to sack the CEO and the board, but as a fellow Carlton supporter, he and his son occupied seats beside me and my son in the Elliott stand at Princes Park. How's that for lucky? Dick agreed to head our appeal committee, and with a short period of time, within a certain amount of arm twisting, the money was raised. When I moved to CSL, the Institute was still in its infancy, and since then it's relocated to the Alfred Hospital campus, and with exceptional leadership, especially from its current director, Brendan Crabb, it's now celebrating its 40th birthday. The Institute is currently on the crest of a wave, with an annual budget of about $100 million, a staff of about 500, and a very significant endowment. And while I can't take any credit for the wave, I think I can fairly claim to have thrown the pebble that created the ripple that became the wave. By the end of the 1980s, things were going well. The virus laboratory at Fairfield and the Institute was thriving, and I had significant roles at WHO and with the federal government. But then one day I was visited by Brian McNamee, the newly appointed 29-year-old CEO of CSL, in search of an R&D director. I was flattered but thought he was nuts. CSL was one of the last government-owned production facilities in the developed world. Established around the time of the First World War to provide national self-sufficiency in critical biologicals, these organisations have thrived and performed a vital public health function at a time when regulatory requirements were either non-existent or minimal, and when the benefits of the products outweighed any concerns about their quality or consistency. But in the 1960s, as a result of a series of events caused by contaminated or inadequately inactivated batches of vaccine, regulators increased their scrutiny, demanding evidence of control of every aspect of the production process. As complying with these requirements required massive new investment, most governments were happy to shutter their facility or sell them off to the private sector. CSL, because it had served the country well in producing insulin, penicillin, polio, antivenom, polio vaccine, antivenoms, and a range of blood products, had survived longer than most. After an independent review recommended that it be sold, the government procrastinated, corporatising the company and installing a CEO with industry experience. And although that improved the profitability, it didn't generate sufficient revenue to enable it to develop new products to meet unmet medical needs. Brian was convinced that if the organisation were privatised and able to take risk and make decisions swiftly, it could thrive, and invited me to join him. It was a strange situation. I was 49 with probably the most influential microbiology position in the country, no experience in product development. And he was a 29-year-old former tennis player. It was not an obvious recipe for success. I discussed it with Di, and she suggested I spend the weekend at Sorrento to thinking about it, and walking along the windswept back beach, considering the future. I recalled Pansy Wright's words about my likely future, more of the same, only better, and decided that trying something different might not only be fun, but if it was successful, could contribute something of national significance. And to the surprise of both Di and my colleagues, who thought I'd either gone mad or was having a midlife crisis, said yes. For the first year or so, I suspected that they were right. CSL circa 1990 still had a public service ethos, and many of its staff with get up and go had got up and gone. The R&D division had a budget of little over $10 million, much of which was spent on maintaining the registration of existing products, leaving little left for innovation. Before I arrived, a small team had conducted a review of new vaccine opportunities, identifying a number of areas where vaccines were both feasible and had sufficient market size to justify the huge investment required. On the list were two areas where Australian scientists were at the cutting edge: Ian Fraser's studies of papillomavirus infection, the major cause of carcinoma of the cervix in women, and Adrian Lee's work on Helicobacter pylori, the causative agent of peptic ulcers. And then the relatively small world of Australian science I knew both well, and was soon able to establish collaborations with their groups. Terry Packer once said, "You only get one Alan Bond in your life. Only a very lucky R&D director gets an Ian Fraser." We began cautiously by providing his group with some reagents that they needed and some advice. But as the work progressed, I was keen to invest to provide CSL with access to any intellectual property that was generated, but my budget was fully committed. So I rang Brian, who was at Tullamarine, en route to Canberra. His only question was, "Do you really want to do it?" And when I said yes, his reply was simply, "Do it, we'll find the money." I did, he did, and the rest is history. Ian and his colleagues generated some patents which we licensed and later partnered partnered with Merck Sharp and Dome, which ended up in the development of Gardasil, the world's first human papillomavirus vaccine. CSL later spent several $1 million defending the patents from a challenge from GSK, which had licensed a similar suite of patents from the NIH and used them as the basis of their papillomavirus vaccine, Cervarix. Eventually, the companies agreed to a cross-licensing deal, which gave both freedom to operate and CSL the benefit of not one but two royalty streams. Not only has Gardasil had a major impact on public health, but it's provided a spectacular return on investment, generating in excess of $1 billion of royalties for the company to date. The R&D director of a major pharmaceutical company has an awesome responsibility, as he or she is responsible for making bets that might commit the company to future expenditure of hundreds of millions of dollars. By the late 1990s, I was acutely aware that the technology was rapidly moving into areas in which I was no longer comfortable, and mindful that it's always better to leave when people are sorry to see you go, than when they're delighted, decided that it was time for a generational change. And with Brian's help, I'd recruited his classmate Andrew Cuthbertson as my deputy. Andrew was very much a next generation person, able to take on the job while he was full of energy, and I was free to use my industry experience to assist a number of public sector initiatives to develop and test candidate vaccines against diseases that were of public health importance, but which were of limited interest to traditional pharma. Looking back, perhaps the most important aspect of my career was being in the right place at the right time. Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, was once asked why he robbed banks, and his answer was, because that's where the money is. Science is also like that. Unless you're the rare genius who redefines a field, you need to be where the action is. It's a bit like surfing. In my day, you drove along the coast to see where the waves were forming. Nowadays, you can consult Wavecam. But either way, on locating the site and entering the water, you swim out to where you're not entirely comfortable and you watch the swell forming. And when you see a suitable wave, you swim like mad and try and catch it. If you get your timing wrong and the wave passes harmlessly by, if you pick the wrong wave, you're likely to get dumped. Either way, you shrug it off and try again, because if you manage to get your timing right, you'll be rewarded with a wonderful ride all the way to the shore. And even more rewarding is to peel off early, paddle back out in time to catch the next wave. And as Stanley Holloway was wont to remind us, all you need is a little bit of blooming luck. Thank you.